Hello everyone and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah share. We're holding a Mishnah Berurah Chelik Aleph and we will be learning today in Yirtzeh Hashem Daf Memhei Amid Aleph, and I hope a piece of Memhei Amid Beis as well. We're in the midst of a complicated piece of Shulchan Aruch over here. We're discussing the parashiyos, the letters of the Tefillin, different types of damage that could occur to the letters, different types of mistakes that we may find in the letters, and when they're kosher and when they're puzzle. Trying to keep it simple. I'm not going to, dig down too far into the details. It's beyond the scope of the shir, but we're trying to at least lay the groundwork. So now, in order for us to go weiter, we're picking up today on Memhei Amud Aleph. We're in the midst of Sif Tez Zayin, Siman limud Beis Sif Tez Zayin, and we're up to Mishnah Berurah Ois Cotton Mem Tes on Memhei Amud Aleph. But before we go weiter, we just have to recapture what it is that we were saying. So in Sif Tez Vav, which started back on Mem Daled Amud Aleph, we started discussing different types of problems that could come up with parashiyos. And in Sif Tez Vav, we had to discuss the minimum size of the leg of a letter. So, for example, this first came to us in the context of the letter Hey. And what we discussed in Sif Tez Vav was, what happens if there's a Hey and the little left-hand foot, the little left-hand regel of the Hey either became damaged, maybe the cloth became punctured where the little regel was and it knocked out a piece of the regel, or maybe some of the diyoi, some of the ink, when the Sefer wrote that little regel, maybe it got scratched off, and now you only have a tiny piece. So the Shulchan Aruch brought down a machlokes. The Mechaber brought down the Shitas Harosh. The Shitas Harosh was that this little regel of the hay has no minimum shear. The Ramah brought down in the name of Shar Paiskim, in the name of other Paiskim, that there is a minimum shear, and that minimum shear is Meloi Ois Kitana, which the Mishnah Berurah identified for us is the size of a complete yud. So that little regel of the hay would have to be the size of a complete yud. Now, the Mishnah Berurah, back in Ois Cotton Mem Beis, on Mem Daled Mem Beis, brought down the Pri Megadim, who said that this halacha does not only apply to the letter Hey, Kasav a Pri Megadim nearly dehuadin l'shar parashiyos. The Mishnah Berurah told us from the Pri Megadim that this halacha applies to other letters as well, Kingoy Dalid, Lamid, Pei Pshuta, Tzadik Pshuta, Kuf, Reish, Taf, Ches. All of these letters, these are letters that have a gag, like a dalid. Picture a dalid. A dalid has a gag, it has a roof, it has a long top, and then it has a leg coming down on the right side. So the Pri Megadim says that this question of how large does a leg have to be in order for it to have significance, and we paskin like the Shar Poiskim, that it has to have the minimum size of a yud. So the same way by the Hey, that little regel, that little left-hand foot has to have the minimum size of a yud. So too, let's say you have a dalid, and the leg of the dalid that is supposed to extend down for the full height of the letter, let's say the bottom part of it gets knocked off, how much has to remain so that we could still consider this letter a dalid? The answer is, says the Pri Megadim, like the Shar Paiskim say over here, Kimaloi Ois Kitana. You have to have a leg that is at least the size of a yud. If you have that leg, you're still okay. So the whole discussion in Sif Tez Vav really surrounded this question of the minimum size of, let's say, the leg of an ois, so that it should still have significance, and we should be able to look at it and say that it still has tzuras ha'ois. It still has the proper form of the letter, and we can halachically consider it that letter. Then we went into Sif Tez Zayin, which starts at Mem Dalet Amud Beis, and I'm just going to read from the beginning of Sif Tez Zayin in the Mechaber, where the Mechaber said, Nifsak achas me ha'oisiyos. If one of the letters became broken, became interrupted, and the Ramah said right away, what kind of letters are we speaking about? Haga, hapshutos. We're talking about the straight letters. Kigoin vav. A vav is a straight letter. All it has is a little rosh. It doesn't have a gag. It doesn't have a roof like a dalid or like the top of a hay. It only has a rosh. It has a head at its top, which is sort of like a yud, and then it has a straight line going down. So a vav is one of the letters that are called the pshutos. Zayin. A zayin is also straight. It has that little rosh, and then, as opposed to a vav that is straight going down, and the leg of the vav goes from the right side of the rosh, the zayin is a leg going down from the middle of the rosh, and it's not perfectly straight. It's shaped a little bit, but it's also one of the oisiyos hapshutos. And then the Ramah said, Oishe nifsak regel hanun, or the nun pshuta. The nun seifis is also very straight if it became interrupted. What do you do by all of these letters? And over here, the Mechaber says, you ask a tinok, you ask a child. And the Mechaber says, Im tinok she'enoi loy chacham v'loy tipesh. You need a chacham, you need a tinok, a child, who's not overly sharp, v'loy tipesh, but he's also not a simpleton. So, Im tinok she'enoi loy chacham v'loy tipesh yodea likroisai. If they could read the letter and identify the letter properly, kosher, then the letter is kosher, v'im lav puzzle, and if they cannot identify it properly, then it's puzzle. So what's the Mechaber telling us over here? The Mechaber together with the Ramah, they're saying if you have a vav, and the leg of the vav either became broken in the middle, so it became separated, right? There's a part of the ink got wiped out. So the leg of the vav is cut in half. In such a case, the bottom piece is no longer has any halachic significance because it's not attached to the top. So we forget about the bottom piece. Now, how do we determine what this letter is? How do we determine if it's a kosher or vav? Now, in the context of Sif Tes Vav, when we were speaking about letters like a hey or a dalid, or, those types of letters that have a top. So then we said, how do we determine if the bottom piece is significant enough? We question whether or not it has a minimum size. So the dalid, you want to know if the leg of the dalid is sufficient? How big is it? If it's the size of a yud, then it's significant, and then it's still a dalid. You have a hey, and you want to know if the right side, the full size leg of the hey, it got chopped in half. You want to know if the hay is still kosher? Depends. How big is the leg? If the leg is the size of a yud, it's a kosher a hay. You have a limud, right? So a limud is a piece on the top, then it has a gag, and then it has a piece on the bottom. You want to know if that piece on the bottom is big enough, if it's significant enough, if part of it got chopped off? Depends. How big is it? Is it the size of a yud? Then it's okay. That was Sif Tes Vav. But now here in Sif Tes Zayin, we're talking about a different type of letter. We're talking about the oisiyos hapshutos. So let's stay simple. Let's imagine a vav. You have the rosh of the vav, you have the leg of the vav, and the leg of the vav either got cut in half, or the bottom part of it got wiped out, it got erased somehow. Now we want to know, is it still a vav? We don't say, like we said in Sif Tes Vav, we don't say the answer is, well, is the leg the size, the minimum size of a yud? If it's the minimum size of a yud, then it's okay. No, we don't say that. Over here, we say you have to ask a tinok. And you ask a tinok what the letter is. Why is that? Why don't we just say, depends, is it the minimum size of a yud? So, in the Mishnah Berurah, in Ois Cotton Mem Vav, on Mem Dalet Amud Beis, told us why you cannot do that. Because over here, like the Ramah said, we're talking about oisiyos hapshutos. Ulefikach, and therefore, said the Mishnah Berurah, ein moilba im nishtayer kimalo yud. Over here, it doesn't help us if the leg of the vav has the minimum size of a yud. The adarabba, nireis ki yud. Now it's going to look like a yud. You see, by a dalid, the dalid has a gag. It has a roof, it has a top, a big long top. If you put a leg under that top, that's the minimum size of a yud, now you have a gag and you have a leg. So it's a dalid. What else could it be? It can't be mistaken for anything else. But by a vav, if you have a roish, and then you have a leg that's the minimum size of a yud, maybe it's a big yud. How do we identify it as a vav? We don't have the ability to, we can't look at it and say for sure that it has the tzura of a vav. So now we need to ask a tinoik. And that's the same thing by a zayin, or by a nun seifis, which is straight. All of these letters, we can't, it's not sufficient to say that the leg has a minimum size because it's the size of a yud. That doesn't give it the proper tzura of the ice that we need. So what we need in that case is, we need to ask a tinoik if he can identify it properly. And now we could pick up where we're up to. Now let's take a look at Mishnah Berurah's Kat Mem Tes, Loi Chacham. So the Mechaber told us, what kind of tinoik do we need? We need a tinoik that's Loi Chacham. He's not overly sharp. He's not too smart for himself. Now, in the context of this halacha, how do we determine if the tinoik is too smart? What does that mean? Explains the Mishnah Berurah, Hainu Chacham kol kach shemevin inyan. The problem is, what if the tinoik that you're asking is very well versed in Chumash? And now you're going to ask him, you're going to show him a Sefer Torah, and you're going to ask him what letter it is. Well, he's familiar with the parasha of Chumash. So he's going to know right away what the word is supposed to be. Because of his knowledge of Chumash, he's going to be able to identify what letter this ois hanifsak, this letter that became interrupted or broken or partially erased, he will be able to identify it because he knows what the pasuk is talking about, and he'll identify it properly so that the mispare shapir, so that the word should make sense. He knows the context of what he's looking at, right? We all know that if there's a word that you don't know the taich of, you don't know the definition, the first thing that you look at is you look at context. It's the same thing. If there's somebody, you're trying to read somebody's handwriting and you're having trouble determining what he wrote, you look at the context and then you try to figure out what the word should be, right? So if this child is a chacham, especially if he's familiar with Chumash, he's going to look at it and he's going to be able to figure out based on the context what the letter should be. Aval ein nikra chacham imhu chacham b'hakaras ha'oisiyos heitev. But when the Mechaber says that you look for a child that's not a chacham, he doesn't mean you look for a child who doesn't have a great recognition of the letters. No, good recognition of the letters is actually a requirement for this tinoik. Ve'ein mevin masha kasel lefanav d'zeh vada gam kein kosher. Certainly somebody who could identify the oisiyos is not considered problematic. He's not considered too much of a chacham. We actually need a child who could properly identify the oisiyos. Ois katan nun. The Mechaber said also v'loi tipesh. He can't be too much of a simpleton. How do we consider which child is too simple for this task? Tipesh hainu she'eni yodea likros ha'oisiyos. The tipesh is the one who doesn't know the letters. You can't ask a child to identify a letter properly if he doesn't know the letters well. The chol she'yodea likros ha'oisiyos, but anybody who could properly read letters, afagav de'ena baki kol kach b'tzuras ha'oisiyos. He's not well versed in how an aleph should be written in Ashuris, that there's a yud on top and that there's a regel on the bottom that looks like an upside down yud. So he's not a professional in Safras. He's not a baki in the tzuras ha'oisiyos. But he knows what's an aleph, what's a beis, what's a gimel, what's a daled, what's a hey. Kol she'omer de'ein boi tzuras ha'ois. As long as he says that this letter does not have the proper form, pasalhu, it is pasal. Now let's go weiter. Top line in the Mechaber, Memhei Amid Aleph. Ve'ein tzarech lachasais lo yishara oisiyos k'may shadayagim. The Mechaber says there is no basis for the minig to cover up the other letters. The Mishnah Berurah explains this. It's cut nun aleph. Ve'ein tzarech lachasais v'kein kasav alavush The Lavush writes this as well, that there's no need to cover up any of the surrounding letters. However, the Magen Avram in the name of the Maharit writes differently. He says that you have to cover up the words that come before the letter that you're asking the tinoch to identify. Why? Because if we allow the child to start reading from the beginning of the pasuk, sirche nakit ve'azel, what we are afraid will happen is his hergel, his knowledge of the words of Chumash will serve him to the extent that he may be able to identify what that word is. Now we can think about this in a very simple way. How many times in the Torah Kedosha does it say Vayidaber Hashem el Moshe lemar? How many times does it say Vayomer Hashem el Moshe? Right? There are certain phrases in the Chumash that occur regularly. And there's also a certain syntax to Chumash where you have certain words that go together very, very often. Therefore, says the Magen Avram, if you're going to allow a child to start from the beginning of the pasuk, again, he may be able to figure out by context what the letter should be. And this is true, says the Magen Avram, even if this child has not learned this parsha in Chumash. So you're taking a child who never learned Sefer Vayikra and you're asking him about a pasuk in Vayikra. Still in all, you don't let him go from the beginning of the pasuk because he may be able to figure it out. The Magen Avram says you still need to cover up the letters that come before, up until this letter. But the word that you're asking him about, the word that contains the problematic letter, as well as the letters that come after the problematic letter, you never have to cover up those letters. Now we have to go weiter. Let's go weiter into the Ramah. Says the Ramah, second line down, Memhei Amid Aleph Haga. Mihu. Imanu Royim Shaloi Nishar Tzura. This is a very important halacha. We're suggesting over here that there are times that you show the letter to a tinoch and you go based on the identification of the tinoch. If the tinoch identifies the letter properly, then we say that the letter is kosher. If the tinoch misidentifies the letter, then we say that the letter is puzzle. Again, which letters are we talking about? Right now, the Ramah said we're talking about oisiyos hapshutos, the straight letters. Now, says the Ramah, miu, imanu royim shaloi nishar tzura sa'ois ketikunoi. If you look at a letter in the Tefillin, or for this matter, this would also apply to a Sefer Torah, and you see that that letter does not have the proper tzura, it simply doesn't have the proper shape, puzzle, then it's puzzle, and I don't care how a tinoch reads it. Even if the tinoch reads it properly, if the letter does not have the requirements of the tzura sa'ois, then a tinoch identifying it properly does not help us. And let's explain this. Let's take a look in here in the Mishnah Berurah. The Mishnah Berurah has a lot of words over here explaining this, but he explains it beautifully. Says the Mishnah Berurah, he's cutting on base. Kigon, for example, alfin. Let's say you have an aleph. Alfin is the plural of aleph. Kigon alfin. Let's say you have an aleph. She'ein hayud shelehen noigas el atzman, where the yud at the top right-hand side of the aleph does not make contact with the body of the aleph. So let's take a look. Over here, we have an aleph. Now, if you notice, when I wrote this aleph, I left a gap. Here's the yud at the top right-hand corner of the aleph, but you see the way I wrote it, it's not attached to the body of the aleph. That's the case that the Mishnah Berurah is talking about here. You have an aleph where the top yud does not make contact with the center body of the aleph. V'chein nekudas hapei. Let's say you have a pei. Now the pei has that little yud in the center of it. Now again, if you look at my picture over here, you'll see that the yud is not attached to the roof of the pei. That's the second case he gives us. So kigoin alfin she'ena yud shelo nagas al atzman, v'chein nekudas hapei she'ena nagas lagaga. If you have a pei where that central yud does not make contact with the roof of the pei, v'chein l'chol oisiyos she'enon pshutos, and so too by all of the letters that are not pshutos, not the straight letters like the vav and the zayin. Sheyesh hefsik be'emtzon, where, let's say, in the middle of the letter is cut. So here's an example over here. Here's a chaf, right? This is a very classic chaf. Now you see the black line I made here? Let's say the back wall of the chaf is cut. There's the ink got knocked out at the middle over there. So you have a chaf, but the top half of the chaf and the bottom half of the chaf are not connected. So all of these are letters when the letter does not have the tzuras ha'os, right? The aleph, if the yud is not connected to the body, that's not the tzuras ha'os. The pei, if the central yud is not attached to the gag, that's not the tzuras ha'os. A chaf that's broken in the back wall is not the tzuras ha'os. And continues the Mishnah Berurah, beinim nasa zeh be'es haksiva, whether the letter was originally written improperly in this fashion, or the ksav became damaged later on. In these cases, asking a tinoik to read the letter is worthless. Of course the tinoik is going to look at that pei and say it's a pei. And he's going to look at that aleph and he's going to say it's an aleph. But it doesn't have the tzuras ha'os. We know it's improper. We know the halachas of how the letters are supposed to be written. And we know that this is not written properly. So therefore, it's not an aleph, it's not a pei, it's not a chaf. I don't care what the Tinoik says. Ella, heicha shenifsa ka'ois ubartzer la mishiyura. When could we ask a child, when could we ask a Tinoik to identify a letter? That's if the ois became interrupted, it became cut. Ubatzer la mishiyura. So it's smaller than it really should be. So our problem is we have a vav that's not a full-length vav. It's not a problem that it doesn't have the tzura of a vav. It has the tzura of a vav. It has a roish, and it has a piece coming down. So it has the tzura of a vav. The only problem is it's too short. And because it's too short, we don't know what is it recognizable as. Is it recognizable as a vav, or is it recognizable as a yud? Now the ois looks a little bit like a different ois. Kigoin vav kitia. You have a vav that's cut. The bottom of the vav got worn out. Shana misupakin. So now we have a doubt. Im higia la'oirich vav. Is it recognizable as a vav? Does it have the length that makes it a vav? We don't mean the technical length. The technical length may very well be just a roish and a little bit the size of a yud. But even if it has the technical length, it might still look like a yud, because it's not as long as a vav typically is. So to be poishit that shaila, we could ask a tinuk. Ulakach toyel kriyas hatinuk. The gilui milsa ba'almahu. Because all we're looking for is a gilui milsa. We only need the eye of a tinuk who's not, who has no agenda and who is not too smart. We need an honest mind, an honest eye to look at it and tell us, does that look like a yud or a vav? The gilui milsa ba'almahu. Dairich vav yesh lam edeloi kara yud. If the tinuk looks at it and, lefi tumai, on his innocence, he says it's a vav. So then we know it's long enough to be recognized as a vav. V'huadin lois nun pshuta, the kaf pshuta. The same thing would be, let's say, by a nun soifis, right? Let me get that up to the camera, right? Over here you have a nun soifis. If it became cut so that the bottom over here is knocked out, so we need a tinuk to look at it and say, does it look like a nun soifis or does it look like a vav? So who adin lois nun pshuta the kaf pshuta, a kaf seifis, sheyesh safik im yesh lem sher arkan. We want to know, are they long enough to be recognized as those letters? I kaf kefufa, or a regular kaf. A regular kaf is very similar to a beis. Shedaima mimiktsas lebeis. If the Sefer wrote it that it was a little bit too squared off, so it looks too much like a beis. So again, over here it's not a technical shaila, whether or not it has the tzuras ha'ois. It has the tzuras ha'ois. But there's something about it that gives us a question, is it truly recognizable as that ois? So then we can ask a tina, kai gavna. Sheyesh listapek im tumunasa doima lois acheres. It has the tzuras ha'ois. But that fact notwithstanding, it still may look somewhat like a different letter. Then we could ask a tinuk. But in cases where the ice clearly does not have the tzuras ha'ois, what is it going to help if a tinuk tells us otherwise? If we look at it, we know that that's not the proper tzura of the ice. Sheregel smoiloi ein nogea lekav ha'emtzoi bishvil she'atinok yukre'ena aleph. If you have an aleph, before we spoke about if the top of the aleph is not attached. Now he's talking about over here, if you have an aleph where the bottom leg of the aleph doesn't touch the body of the aleph. In that case, and you can't be makshirit bishvil sha'atinok yikrena aleph based on the fact that the tinok calls it an aleph. Because what else is he going to call it? Of course, if you show this to a tinok, right? You show this to a tinok, even if that leg is not touched to the body of the aleph, of course he's going to call it an aleph. What else is he going to call it? So the Mishnah Berurah tells us, the mipnei pirud, based on the fact that that lower leg is separated from the body of the aleph, lo yita loimish hi ayin afucha. What else is he going to say? Is he going to discount? What do you want him to say? You have a havamina that he's going to see a separation between the bottom yud of the aleph and the body of the aleph. So now what he's going to do is he's going to discount that bottom piece and he's going to look at it like a mirror image ayin. He's not going to make that mistake. And this same concept applies to the straight letters, to the oisiyos apshutais. Im anu royim, if we see vadai, certainly, she'ein by tzuras ha'ois, that the ois pshuta doesn't have the tzuras ha'ois, loy mahani maditina kariyos hakach. If we see a nun seifis, and there's no question in our mind that it is much too short and it's a zayin, right? So, the fact that the tinuk is going to say it's a nun seifis, that doesn't help us. If we have a nun seifis, but the Bakir looks at it and says, that looks funny, it's short. Like, usually the nun seifis goes quite a bit under the line. This nun seifis, goes a mashu under the line a little bit, but not much. I don't know. It looks, maybe it looks like a zayin. So then you could ask a tinuk. But if you have a letter, a word, and you look at it, it's supposed to end with a nun seifis, and you look at it, and for heaven's sakes, it ends with a zayin, then the fact that the tinuk is going to look at it and call it an endanun, no, I'm sorry, that says the Mishnah Berurah doesn't help. Rak besavik lanum yesh b'shikaray mahani. Now the Mishnah Berurah ends off this ice cut of the Mishnah Berurah with a little bit of a cryptic phrase that took me a few minutes to figure out what he means. Actually, I had to look at the Biur Halacha to figure out what he means. V'chol zeh b'lo tikud. This whole discussion is only when you're not fixing the letter. This discussion is, you looked at the Tefillin, you saw a problem, and now you're not sure what the letter is. We're dealing with the question of whether or not you could show it to a tinuk. And we're saying that if it doesn't have the tzuras ha'ois, then showing it to a tinuk doesn't help. V'chol zeh b'lo tikud. But that's only, we're not talking about if you're going to go fix it. When it comes to the question of fixing the letter, look at the Biur Halacha. What does he mean? It means it's like this. We know that Tefillin and mezuzahs have to be written kisidron. So sometimes, if the letter is bad, you have no way to fix the Tefillin. because if you're going to go back and fix it now, it doesn't help because it wasn't written Kisidron. Over here, the Biur Halacha tells us, and this is what Mishnah Berurah means here, that there's a little bit of a kula. If the tinoik could properly identify the ice, even though the ice does not have the proper tzura. So let's say that aleph, where the yud is not connected to the center portion of the aleph, but if the tinoik could read it like an aleph, then it could be that you could fix it, and we're not going to passel it because it was written Shaloi Kisidron. Okay. Let's turn back to Mem Hey Amud Aleph. The last two words on the bottom line of the Shulchan Aruch. Ha demachshirinon kishenifsak ois. All of these cases where we are saying that when a letter was cut and now there's a way to make it kosher. So for example, the dalid, where the leg of the dalid was cut off at the bottom, but we said it's kosher if you have a leg that has the minimum size of a yud. Or you have an ois pshuta like a vav, but it's not really long enough, but we showed it to a tinoik, and the tinoik said that it's a vav. So in all of these kind of cases, okay? So again, what does the Mechaber say? These cases where we're rendering the tefillin kosher, even though a letter has been cut. Dafka kishenichtav bekashrus v'achakach nifsak. That's only if it was written properly, and then it became cut. Now, the Mishnah Berurah is going to tell us that the Mechaber is talking about a very specific case. If you remember, we kept on saying throughout that when we're talking about these letters that got cut, there's two ways a letter could get cut. Let's go back to our classic case of the dalid and the leg of the dalid. Could be that the ink got scratched away, so the lower portion of the regel of the dalid is not attached to the upper portion. That's one case. The other case is where the cloth got punctured. So the area of the cloth where the lower piece of the dalid attaches to the upper piece of the regel of the dalid, the cloth became punctured over there. So now physically, it's not connected, the bottom and the top. Now there's a huge difference between those two. Because in the second case, where the cloth got punctured, then we can only say that the letter is kosher if the puncture happened after the tefillin were written. Why? Because of the shaila of mukaf gvil. We always say all of the letters have to be completely surrounded by blank parchment when it is written. So if the dalid was written and everything was fine and dandy and the dalid was mukaf gvil, and then somehow the cloth became punctured in middle of the regel of the dalid so that the bottom portion of the regel of the dalid is no longer attached to the upper portion of the regel of the dalid, now we could say that if the upper portion of the regel of the dalid has the minimum size of a yud, it's a kosher dalid anyway. It's not mukaf gvil, but it was mukaf gvil when it was written. Since it was mukaf gvil when it was written, it's okay. But if there was a hole in the parchment, and you wrote the dalid so that you wrote the top of the gag of the dalid, and then you wrote the bottom of the gag of the top of the regel of the dalid, and then you wrote the bottom of the regel of the dalid on the other side of the hole, and now you want to say it's kosher because the top portion is the minimum size of a yud. No, it's not. Because that dalid wasn't mukaf gvil when it was written. And that's what the Mechaber is talking about over here. He's saying, these cases when we're saying that you could render a letter kosher even though it's interrupted by a hole in the cloth, and he doesn't say that, that's only if when it was written it was okay and it was mukaf gvil, and then it became cut due to a puncture. But if the hole in the parchment, that's the case we're talking about. We're not talking about a letter that was cut because the ink got worn away or the ink got scratched off. We're talking about letters that were interrupted because of a puncture in the cloth. But But if there was a hole in the cloth at the time that the letter was written, and that hole in the cloth is interrupting the letter, oy im regel hakaf hapshuta, or if you have a kaf seifis, so it's that long kaf, oy ki yotzeba, or a similar letter, and magia l'seif haklaf, and the letter extends all the way to the bottom edge of the klaf, beli hekef klaf, so that this chaf seifis is not mukaf gvil mitkilasai from the time it was written, puzzle, then it's puzzle. So again, this mechaber is written almost cryptically. You don't know right away what he means if you read it in a simple way. What he's saying is, in these cases where we say that a letter got damaged, but he's speaking about a specific type of damage. He's not talking about where the ink got scraped off. He's talking about when there was a puncture in the cloth. So when we say that you could kasher a dalid, where the regel of the dalid got interrupted by a puncture in the cloth, as long as the top portion of that regel is the size of a yud, it's kasher. That's only if that hole in the cloth happened after the dalid was written. So that when the dalid was written, it was mukaf gvil. But if it was written that way, so that the regel of the dalid, the top part of the regel of the dalid, terminated at a hole in the cloth when it was originally written, then that dalid wasn't mukaf gvil mitkilasai. In that case, that dalid is puzzle and there's no way to kasher it. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ois Katan Nun Gimel, Kishenifsak Ois, V'hu adin madamachshel le'el b'sif tesvav im nikev regel hahei. This halacha also goes back to sif tesvav. In sif tesvav, where we spoke about that little left side regel of the hay, and we said that if part of it is missing because of a puncture in the cloth, it's kosher if it has the minimum size of a yud. That's only if when that little regel of the hay was written, it was mukaf gvil. But if that little regel of the hay was written very tiny because it bordered on a puncture in the cloth, then when it was written it wasn't mukaf gvil, then that hay is puzzle. Ava benikev chalaloi, but when the center of the hay, the inside of the hay, got a hole in it, the machshir shama mechaber, where the mechaber said that's kosher, hu afilu nikev koydem aksiva, that's true if there was a puncture in the cloth in the center of the hay, or in the center of a dalid, or in the center of a base, even at the time of the writing. And that's because of the shittas that hold that you don't need mukaf gvil on the inside of the letters. Ois katan nun dalid. So this is only true if the letters were written properly, va'achakach nifsak, va'atam, and the reason for this distinction is, deloy be'inan mukaf gvil rak be'esak siva. Because the requirement of mukaf gvil, the requirement that the letter has to be surrounded at all sides by blank parchment, is only at the time of the writing. So even if you have a puncture in the parchment between two letters, so that puncture reaches the edge of both letters, gamkein kosher. That's also kosher if it happens after the ksiva. Achena der Chaim Milchus Kriyas HaTorah bedin chavzayin machmer bazeh vayin bebir halacha. V'da oid, and you should know furthermore, to be'inyan negias ha'oisiyos. When it comes to the shiloh of two letters touching each other, afilu im yedea bebir shenasa la'achar aksiva gam kein posel. One of the problems of two letters touching each other is that they're not mukaf gvil, because where the two letters make contact with each other, they're not surrounded by blank parchment. That, the Mishnah Berurah says over here, even if we know that the two letters were separated when it was written, so when it was written the letters were mukaf gvil, and somehow they became attached later, it's still possible. V'chein mashma b'bei Shmuel b'Evan Ezer b'siman kuf chav hei siv katan chav tes in hilchas gittin. Ayin sham d'sfir le'gamkein d'tzarch lachos shel tiras rishon shebebeis Yosef b'dibur hamaskil v'im toimar, when this is beyond the scope of the shir, de'ein mechalik b'negia beinim loy hukaf beis aksiva oy achakach. So just to encapsulate what is within the scope of the shir, what the Mishnah Berurah has told us is, the requirement of mukaf gvil is only at the time of the writing. However, he's telling us here there are a couple of exceptions. One exception over here is if a hole forms in the cloth between two letters, so that the hole extends from the edge of one letter to the edge of the next letter. Even if that happens after the ksiva, that could be problematic. And if two letters are touching each other, and they only touched each other after the ksiva, that could also be problematic. Ais katan nun hey, mitchila. If when the letters were first written, they were not mukaf gvil, they were written up to a puncture in the parchment, then it's puzzle. Ubisafik masai nasa hanekev. What if we have a suffix? We don't know when this puncture occurred in the cloth. Toilin dakar ksiva nasa. We assume that it happened after the ksiva. Because if it would have been like that at the time of the writing, the Sefer would have seen it. And he wouldn't have put it in the Tefillin. He wouldn't have said it's kosher. Unless it's a very small hole. Ais katan nun vav, nekev. The words of the Mechaber. If there was a puncture in the cloth at the time that it was written, says the Mishnah Berurah katan nun vav, dafkad nekev ikera. We're talking, the Mechaber in this halacha is addressing specifically the case where a letter is interrupted due to a hole in the cloth or a tear in the cloth. Even if it's a very tiny slit. And the problem is that the letter is not mukaf gvil at the time of the writing. But if it's just that the ink got scratched away, kosher ve'etzar shum tikun, kevin sheyesh shir ois ad b'kaim haru. What he's talking about over here is, again, let's say you have the dalid with the little regel, and that regel is the size of a yud. If the top portion of the regel and the top portion of the regel are separated not by a hole, just by a scratch through the ink, if the regel is big enough, you don't even have to fix it. It's a very interesting shaila. What if there are just hairline separations in the ink of the letter within the necessary shear? So you have a dalid, and it has a regel, but within the top portion of that regel, that's the minimum size of a yud, there are hairline cuts through the ink. Is that a problem? He says, Ayin Mabir Halacha B'Sif Chafei, where I believe he says he could be Mekel. Nun Zayin, if the regel of a kaf pshuta, the regel of a kaf pshuta means the back wall of the kaf pshuta, right? Here you have a kaf, a regular, well actually, a kaf pshuta, I'm sorry, a kaf pshuta is an endechaf. Okay, there's your kaf shooter. Right? A kaf seifis. Mishnah Berurah. What did I just, what's saying? Yeah, we're in Mishnah Berurah is cutting on Zion. I'm sorry, I got distracted and I got to the wrong place. So the Mechaber said, if the regel of a kaf pshuta of an endechaf, which is very long, if it went all the way to the bottom edge of the parchment at the time of the writing, so it wasn't mukaf kvil, that would be puzzle. Ais cutting on Zion regel, the leg of the kaf pshuta of the kaf seifis, the cholshike gage oisiyos ve'emtzon. Certainly, the top of a letter or the middle of a letter, she'elahem hekef gvil be'es haksiva, if they were written up against the edge of the parchment, so that they were not mukaf gvil be'es haksiva, that would also be a problem. The nakat regel l'revusa. The reason the Mechaber tells us the case of the end of chaf is because there's an additional chiddush. Again, what's the Mishnah Berurah saying? The Mechaber said if a letter is written all the way up to the edge of the cloth, so that when it was written it's not mukaf gvil, that's puzzle. And the letter that the Mechaber chooses to use to illustrate this point is one of the extra long letters, like a chaf seifis. If the bottom of the chaf seifis goes all the way to the edge, to the bottom edge of the parchment, to the end of the cloth, and it was written that way mitchila, it's possible because it wasn't mukaf gvil when it was written. Says the Mishnah Berurah, why is he giving us that case, a chaf seifis? Any letter, let's say a dalet. Let's say you wrote a dalet all the way at the end of the cloth, so that the left-hand side of the gag of the dalet is all the way up against the edge of the cloth. So it's not mukaf gvil, and it's puzzle. Why give us the case of the bottom of a chaf seifis? Explains the Mishnah Berurah because there's an additional chiddush. And the additional chiddush is a cute chap. After be'ez ksiva soifa regel kvar nigmar tzuras ha'ois karoi, how long does an end of chaf have to be already? So by the time you get to the very bottom tip of the chaf seifis, the tip that touches the bottom edge of the cloth, you already have a kashera end of chaf before you get all the way to the bottom. So maybe we could just ignore the very bottom tip of the chaf seifis, and we could claim that the chaf seifis was written and it had the tzuras ha'ois and it was mukaf gvil before you finished it. Maybe we could just ignore that bottom tip. Kamash Balon, you can't. Afil rachi kalzman shaloi silek yadai min ha'ois. As long, you see, if you would have written the chaf seifis and you would have stopped for a second before you hit the bottom edge of the cloth, we would say, okay, when it was written, it was mukaf gvil. But if you wrote it all the way down to the bottom edge of the parchment, even though you extended it much longer than it had to be extended, doesn't matter. When it was written, it wasn't mukaf gvil. Mikri davazebe saksiva b'ino l'chala ois hakafas gvil. Ois katan ches. If it was written b'li hekef, fa'afilu im hiaruka karoi, even if it has the proper length. Even though you might say, hey, look, you know what, we'll just scratch off the bottom of the end of chaf, and now it'll be mukaf gvil, and it's long enough, and it's fine. Mekamaka and puzzle, it's still puzzle. It's cut in test. Mitchilasai, it has to be mukaf gvil from its origination. Avalim nechtach haklaf achakach, v'ayidei zeh in mukaf gvil, kosher. If you wrote a letter almost to the edge of the parchment, but then you stopped and it was mukaf gvil. But now a piece of the parchment got snipped off. So now the letter is all the way to the edge of the parchment and it's not mukaf gvil. That's okay. Puzzle. If you wrote all the way down to the bottom edge or all the way to a side edge, it's puzzle. Says the Mishnah Berurah, if you want to fix it, yigrar ktsas k'dei sheyeh mukaf gvil. You have to scratch away part of the letter so that it should be mukaf gvil. But you cannot attach an additional piece of parchment on. In other words, you wrote it all the way to the edge, now you could scratch off a piece and then go weiter. And that's okay. That's now considered mukaf gvil be'esak siva. But you want to write it all the way to the edge of the parchment and then extend the parchment, that you cannot do. Because when we say that the letters have to be mukaf gvil, it has to be mukaf gvil with cloth that you're allowed to write on. And a patch is not kosher for writing. Okay. We'll stop over here and pick up next time with Sif Yud Zayin. So Baruch Hashem, we made up today for the page that I missed on, I believe it was, wow, time flies. I guess it was Sunday night. Okay, thank you so much for joining me for Limud HaTorah. This is Limud HaTorah, you're making against Klal Yisrael. Rabban Shem should send Yeshua Sefer pronounced Shidduchim to all those in need, and we should be zeichet to see the BS God Tzedek b'meher v'yameinu. Amen. Be well.